Okay, this is the start of Studio 2. And so I'm going to go over Studio 2 and what you're going to do. So what we are going to do is make book covers. And you're going to actually make two book covers, both for the same exact book. But you're going to make two different layouts to explore the two basic types of composition, right? One that is symmetrical, either bilaterally or approximately. It's going to have a strong top to bottom movement, right? So it'll have a central axis to your composition, and it will be as visually compelling as you can make it. Layout number 2 is going to be an asymmetric, right? And in exercise 12, we learned about the compositional structures for that. So we've got our Fibonacci spiral, our rule of thirds, our golden triangles, our phi grids, all these things. You're going to have dynamic movement, which means the movement is largely diagonal, triangular, or circular. And of course, it's going to have to be visually compelling. Of course, with both of these, right, you need a main focal point. You need to have movement. You need to have balance. These are all the things that we're working with. So quickly, let's look at the sheet here. Let me find it here. Whoops, there it is. So you've been asked to create a book cover for a novel, and you're going to need to come up with two layers, symmetrical and asymmetrical. We went over this. Ultimately, this is to explore hierarchy, movement, and balance. Right? So we want to use all kinds of visual techniques, and I'll allow you just to read over this, not to bore you reading through these. So what you need to do is pick a book that with an object in the title and that has at least 3 words. So my example is going to be the book The Feather Thief, which you'll see in the slides when I go back to them, right? Because that gives me an easy object, right? A feather, right? I know I can cut a feather out of a photo really easily because you're going to have to knock out things. One other thing is that I don't want you using any people images in your layout, unless it's something like a hand or something, but people provide their own wrinkle to this. Also, when I let students do people, they'll go for like someone who was in the movie version of it and stuff, and I absolutely don't want you doing that. I want you coming up with your own object-based layout. So what you're going to do is use a compositing technique, right? We learned in the Chimera project how to knock things out, put them together, you know, titles over images, we learned text. So all this is going to come together. So all of the images that you use should be public domain or Creative Commons licensed and of proper resolution, right? And I'll talk about the resolution of the project after this. In the slide I talked about, right, you need these two layouts, a stable formal, which is a symmetrical or near symmetrical layout, and a dynamic, right? And that's where we have asymmetry, using some of those, you know, maybe perhaps using some of those compositional structures, right? So something that moves your eye around in different ways, that the white space becomes more active versus the white space on a symmetrical one is usually very, very much less active. You know, it's not really, it doesn't feel like a part of the composition the way that it does in a dynamic one. So anyhow, requirements, open license raster images. Each layout needs at least one knocked out object from raster images. So you shouldn't use, again, this is you compositing things. You shouldn't in any way find someone else's composited photo illustration to use in this because you're going to be providing me with your original images. You're doing all the thought and compositing work in this, right? So find a single picture of a clock or a single picture of a feather and knock it out. Don't use someone else's composited work and knock it out, which I already said. You're not allowed to use a white background in this, right? I want you to expand from the defaults of software. One layout must use texture manipulated in some way. So remember the album art one where you use the layer blend modes to manipulate things. I'm expecting you to do that in the least one, if not both. Each layout needs the book name, right? Paying attention to readability contrast, but also remember the way we break the titles, the way we emphasize and de-emphasize certain words, right? I don't want you just to click and type your title all the way across, right? That is absolutely what I don't want you to do. Each layout also needs your author name somewhere. I don't want you using it by Ernest Hemingway. Just say Ernest Hemingway. Forget the word by. It's just a junk word. Absolutely not needed. Everyone knows if there's a name on it, there's no need for that by. And you're going to need to use at least two visually compelling techniques that were talked about in the composition quiz video. So things like overlap, breakout, and crop off the page, all those things, orientation, right? Just playing with scale. These things will make your work more visually compelling than just putting things together. You can use lines and abstract shapes that you make. That's absolutely fine. The thing I want to remind you about this is that this is absolutely not about like your creativity. I mean, I welcome you to add your own creativity to this project, but ultimately this is a project about composition, right? So what I care most about is that you have something in the hierarchy that I know is the main focal point. You have subdominant focal points, and you move me through all of these things together. You create something visually compelling, right? So if you don't have some cute idea, I don't care. I more care about good, clean design using all the principles that we started with. Okay, so the rest of this I have in the slides, so I'm going to go ahead and go to those after I just tell you that this is going to be done in Photoshop. Obviously, if you needed to make things in Illustrator and drag it through, that's fine, but ultimately you're going to do this in Photoshop. And you should create a document then that's 6 by 9 inches at 300 dpi, CMYK. I should probably update it to say CMYK, right? Because we're making a print work, so this is exactly how we would set up our file. So just make sure that you do this and that it's 6 by 9 inches. I've had people like start working and it's like 6 by 9, I don't know, either way too small or way too big because they don't use the inches unit, and at 300 dpi. Okay, and of course where you can find images, all the sites we've been to. And I will say that we, Studio One, I broke it up because Studio One was actually a lot about design process, if you noticed. This one, I'm not having you hand in any design process artifacts. I showed you the design process. Likely this one, you'll maybe do a little combination of trying to sketch and figure out some things. But you don't have to submit any of that. Also, part of it may just be you pushing things around in Photoshop, but I highly recommend sketching a little bit just to kind of get yourself started, some ideas. Okay, going back to our slideshow. So let's start with layout 1. So if this was what you handed in for layout 1, obviously this would be a 3 points out of 100 or whatever points there are, right? Super boring. Default background, everything's like this is the feathers. The only thing this has is that it at least has the junk word de-emphasized. But other than that, it's just a straight line down. Everything's so separate, super static and boring. So you absolutely don't want to hand in something like this. Here's something that maybe is starting to get a little better, right? We've got some overlap happening here. We've got some hierarchy getting established. So it's not terrible, right? It's all right. But you could even push this further. And so something like this, right? We've got this, we're playing with scale. Think about how we've magnified these. We're not used to seeing this magnification of the feathers. Not only that, the feathers provide repetition. And they also run on diagonal lines, even though we still have a strong central axis. We have, and then they get countered by the orientation of this, right, which is treated very differently in text than these. We have overlap, right? So these words actually tuck underneath these things. This tucks underneath that, right? This word tucks underneath that, right? The whole thing is, the feathers are all cropping off the page too, making us think, oh, it's part of a larger thing. So it's got so much stuff going on, so many visually compelling things. It still has a nice, strong central axis. This would be amazing for you to get to this point in this layout. Layout 2 should be asymmetric, right, with obviously the different type of movement, not straight up and down, but instead of a more triangular, diagonal, or circular movement, right? So look at these ones. We've got obviously a lot of overlap going over here, but if I look at this thing, I come like this, zoom, I kind of come in a circle to this. Same with this one. I come up from the top, I lead in with this, the feather leads me down to the girl at midnight, and then I kind of come back up to here, right? So I've got like a lead in and a circle here going on. That's asymmetric. Here's some more asymmetric. This one's using space, right, to have a triangle created between these three items right here. This one, we have this here and kind of a diagonal that comes down, right? So I'm kind of in a diagonal here. Same with this one, right? I have a diagonal line that leads me this way to the bird and back up to this, right? They're kind of batting each other off. So that's the movement in these ones. Here's just some more random things I found that have asymmetrical layouts, right? You know, these things are countering this thing with this little thing here, so we've got a little triangle happening. Same with this one. We have more of a, you know, maybe this is even, yeah, I don't know what layouts. I mean, these aren't using like particularly different layouts. This one, yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that I love the empty space here, but I mean, it is asymmetrical, you know, and here's just some more just exemplars, right, of laying things out. So also notice the size of the text. Your text doesn't have to be this giant text. I mean, it could be, but I find in this exercise, a lot of students are afraid. They're like, I got to make the text all the way. We don't have to read a book cover from across the room, right? The other things in there can provide the things that attract us to pick up our book, right? Because ultimately what we want to do is we want to sell this book and we want people to understand what the book is. So here's a good example of two different layouts. Now, obviously, they're not from this class. They're just ones I found online that someone did, but it's an example of the same book, one in asymmetry, right? And one in, I'm sorry, this one in symmetry and one in asymmetry, right? So we have the strong line that goes down. These provide some interesting leading lines to this person. This here we have like, right, the kind of the eye line going back and forth to this, you know, and the space is balanced really interestingly, right, where this little thing right here balances out this big thing right here. So this is just an interesting thing. So again, I suggest that you sketch first, and the reason for that is that sketches are so low stakes, right? Once you get on the computer, you kind of get stuck on like, you're like, oh, I already knocked this out, so I'm going to use this thing. And it may not work. So I would highly recommend that, you know, they don't have to be very good sketches, as you see by this right here that I grabbed. Just something that blocks out and maybe gives you an idea of what the objects are, so that you know you're creating symmetry, you know that you're creating asymmetry, right? And things like that. It's so much better to sketch than it is to just open up a computer and start working. Trust me, because then you just get fixated on the things you have in front of you, when it's so much easier to throw away sketches. So some more advice for this is that you actually on your page just slowly build it up, right? Put in one object at a time. Then as you add elements, I would just look at how they interplay with each other. Turn on and off elements just to check out if they're adding or subtracting from your composition. Right? Make sure you're looking at like proximity and overlap and things to figure out values. And like I said, we don't need to read your text across from the room, right? So don't be afraid to make your text, as long as it's like, you know, not microscopic, it should still play a role in being a focal point, right? The three main focal points you're probably going to have is some object, you know, the name of your book, and the author name. But you may add more objects, right? You don't have to have only one object, right? It just depends on what you're going for. So that is an introduction to Studio 2. Obviously, if you have any questions, contact me, but read over the Studio 2 sheet. Remember that you are doing only one book in two ways, right? So they're not two separate books. It's the same book, two different ways. And yeah, that's it. I do great work.